The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the viewers of the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Sister Robin, a dedicated viewer and supporter who I appreciate greatly. Brother Ogawa, the hardest working man in YouTube or any other part of the net. He's given me a lot of support and I appreciate it. Carnita Groves, greetings. Rashamela, Ubuntu Gogust, who we've had on a number of times before. Greetings. This is a live show. I know you've been getting a lot of reruns and stuff like that. First, I want to encourage people, if you like the show, hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed, subscribe. And if you've enjoyed the show, get more of your viewers, your friends to watch it. This has been going on 4 years, and we've done over 200 shows. And it's, for me, this is art. So I'm putting out my best. And I don't do something unless I'm inspired to do it. I'm not a YouTuber, even though I've learned some of the rules of YouTube. You know, I'm not into their money game. I'm not into making money for them. And even though I've learned a lot about how you do this stuff, it's people like Ogawa and Cinnabar, who's been with me from the beginning, and others who have the real expertise. And I'm a OR, original revolutionary, and I'm a spiritual blues man. I'm into creativity. And so I know that being broke is no joke, but I don't have any allegiance to the Star Spangled Banner. I'm a spiritual blues man. My allegiance is to the blues people because my daddy is from Bunkie, Louisiana, and my grandmother is from the birthplace of the blues, Mississippi. You hear me? And I'm a Pan-Africanist. But it's a poor frog that don't put its own pond first. You hear me? So one of the reasons I've been doing a lot of these rebroadcasts is, one, we have viewers that haven't seen some of these, and so it gets them to watch it. But the main reason is I'm finishing this book, and like yesterday, before I prepared for this show, I spent from the morning until noon working on my book. The book comes first. The show is not first, because this is ephemeral, this thing called YouTube and Facebook. Here today, and it could be gone tomorrow. And so, so even though I think it's very important, in my show are chapters in a book, each one is carefully laid out, thought through, but there's a lot of improvisation and creativity involved in it. And I bring on masters who bring in a lot of insights of their own. So these are really chapters in a book for this show. And some of them are going to be put into books. So this is important, but the writing is more important. And more important than the writing is the organizing. So those are my priorities. And whatever I do, I got to feel it. If I don't feel it, I'm not doing it. And that's been my rule throughout life. I don't jump to no dead presidents. Or to the ones who think they're running things right now. They're not me, you know. So that's been the main reason that you've been getting rebroadcasts as I'm finishing this book, and it's going along quite well. I expect it to be finished before the end of this year. It's a piece of beauty. I'm a poet and I'm a strategist. Strategy is an aesthetic art. I pointed this out before. There are only 3 arts higher than strategy: God, who's the greatest artist and everything of all; love, which is the essence of God and the most important thing you have, with your love of self, love of family, love of people, love of humanity; and the truth. And of course, we call it Ma'at, but long before I knew anything about Ma'at, that's what I was following. So that is my main guide. I follow the truth. And so strategy, next to God, love, and the truth, is the ultimate art. I'm sure God would be the ultimate strategist, but God doesn't need strategy. God created all of this, you know? So when it comes to my work, organizing and battles, I'm a warrior scholar. The key to that is I was endowed with this gift of strategy. If I didn't have it, then I'd find somebody that did, or somebodies. And so those are my priorities, you know. And this is the Afro net you're on right here. But I say there's 3 nets: the Ignornet, the Infonet, and the Afronet. The majority of people watch the Ignornet. And I'm just going to say something before I get into this. I've seen, this is on the Ignornet. This is the first time, and I've talked to James Smalls, he said the same thing, that we've ever seen anybody put down Pan-Africanism. Black. You hear me? Now that is at the core of ignorance, but I understand why, because some of the youth on the Ignornet are being propagandized by Blacks who are being paid by the right wing. And they are pro-Trump. They are pro-immigration into this country as long as it's white. but they're against black immigrants, brown immigrants, red or yellow, but especially black. You hear me? When Trump was in office for his 4 years, they didn't raise the question of reparations. But as soon as Biden got in, they were telling blacks, first of all, don't vote for him unless he embraces reparations, which he said he supported and has done nothing for, but that's better than Obama. But he was desperate, and we saved him. So he had to say that, you know? But so you've been trapped. I'm not talking to my viewers here. I'm talking to the ones who come in under this, and you've been fooled. And so anything that's African, you put it down because, you know, you're claiming that you're born here. You know what I mean? Yeah, we're born here, but a biscuit in an oven is a biscuit. And you put an African anywhere, he's still an African. You take an African out of Africa, Africa's still in him, and he carries or she carries Africa wherever they are. And so I had one comment on one of the shows. I didn't have time to go pull it up. And so somebody is making a comment against Pan-Africanism, and this is what they said. Well, we know that Harriet Tubman was against Pan-Africanism. I guess the propagandists told them that. A, there was no word Pan-Africanism during the history and the life of Harriet Tubman. She would have been an Ethiopianist at this point because Pan-Africanism springs out of the passage in the Bible that Garvey subscribed to that said, princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall stretch forth his hand unto God. In 1900, at the first Pan-African Congress called by Sylvester Williams in London, that's when we first hear the word Pan-Africanism. And that's a gift of the African in America during enslavement, but they didn't call it then Pan-Africanism, they called it Ethiopianism because Ethiopia was the only true free African state during the whole period of colonialism. And then out of Ethiopianism comes Pan-Africanism, you know? So somebody is claiming that Harriet Tubman was against Pan-Africanism. Harriet Tubman? Are you kidding? And I know most of the people on the internet don't read, so somebody told them that. So that's why I'm not going to call them ignorant. They have been taking some crap that's been coming from sources that are anti-African, that are right-wing, and don't care 2 cents about Project 2025. Not 2 cents. So I just want to say that this misinformation that we get on the internet has made some of our people dumb down to a point that you've never expected to see before. So that's all I'm saying. This ain't what you're getting here. And, you know, from any of the others who are putting down good information, because the AfroNet has got some good stuff and the InfoNet does, you know. Democracy Now! I would put in the InfoNet. Very good. I really enjoy that show. They ain't black. So what? They're dealing with truth. So I want to say also that we want to extend to the Palestinian people, the people of the Sudan, and the people of the Congo, who are especially undergoing death and destruction, our support for them and our love for them. Some of our brothers and sisters are misinformed on the Palestinian issue. They think that because they're Arabs, they don't deserve our support. Some say, well, they enslaved us, you know, they came in and knocked off Ghana, Mali, and Songhay, you know, true, you know, there were Moravids who came into Ghana, you know, sweeping in. And many of them were the ones who were coming out of Moorish Spain, which Africans ran from 711 to 1491 AD. Under Tariq bin Ziyad, they conquered Spain for that whole period of time. And then finally, when the Spanish got together, they ran them out. They ran the Arabs out, the Africans out, and the Jews out mostly, except those that converted and claimed to be Spanish. So that's an excuse that some people provide. That's historically inaccurate. You know, first of all, yeah, there were Arabs that enslaved us. And a part of that crew were some Africans who came in who thought the Arab way. Armand, 2000 Seasons, talks about that. Some Africans who were more Arab than the Arabs or more European than the Europeans, you know? So are we going to say that we are not going to support Africa because there were some Africans involved in the slave trade, or there were some Africans who swept in to Ghana, Mali, and Songhai and did some damage, even though it was primarily Arabs doing it? Are we going to say that? But here's the key point. If you look at the Palestinians have been at the heart in this country of Black resistance movements. When Ferguson goes down, the Palestinians are there. They're not there because they have some hatred for Black people. They're there because they face oppression in Palestine. We face oppression here. They're inspired by our movement. We've been inspired by their resistance. And so if I see humans suffering anywhere on the planet, it hurts me. But when I see humans who have been put in a situation of colonialism by the British and the Americans and the rest of the European tribes and are now being subject to genocide, I'm not going to be silent on that. I support them. Whatever I can do, I'll support them. And in future shows, we'll be getting into the Sudan because it's tremendous suffering going on there. And today's show is not going to focus primarily on current events in the Congo today. We'll do more of that later, but we will provide a background for that and get into that. And there's tremendous suffering in the Congo, greater than any area of the world today, where millions of Africans have been dying because of resource wars financed by corporations, and in the US and around the world, and China, and neighboring African states, Rwanda, Uganda, and others, operating in the interest of the US, but in their own personal greed interests. So this show today, while it will be focusing on a great man, it's a condition of the people to today that we have to address, and I'll be putting my stuff on it. Gerard said, too many people are silent. You're right. And the sister makes the comment that people in Kenya have stood up. You're darn right. I mean, they're being taxed to pay off IMF and World Bank bills by being taxed on bread. That's the nature of the rich. They don't care 2 cents about humanity. 2 cents, not a dime, So yeah, that was beautiful to see. They actually shut that down. We extend our support, suffering people all over the planet, but those especially. Before getting in today's show, I want to pay tribute to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Nathan Hare. Dr. Nathan Hare was the founder of Black Studies in the United States. He's the father of it, and joined with the students at San Francisco State to bring about the strike for Black Studies, and then suffered for it for many years. The San Francisco Freedom Movement, that I had the privilege to be maximum leader of, but there were a number of leaders. We gave birth to the experimental college. Some of our students who were arrested at the Sheraton Palace Hotel, a campaign led by a young sister named Tracy Sims, who led a group called the Ad Hoc Committee. Tracy is now a retired teacher. She was 18 years old at that time. And she's the one that brought in UC Berkeley students and San Francisco State students, a place that I'd graduated from, and that she had stepped down from. She dropped out temporarily. And those students got radicalized, gave birth to the free speech movement because they were thrown in jail for a year. White students coming from the premier university in the United States, University of California, that's huge, and the Nobel laureates it's produced and everything else. We Blackenized them, radicalized them. And then some of them came from San Francisco State. They went back to state and started the experimental college. Black students later took it over and took over the tutoring programs that white students had been running, took it over, and then brought Sonia Sanchez, Askia Muhammad Touré, and Amiri Baraka to state to teach. And as I pointed out before, Sonia Sanchez, one of our great poets, I named her 2 twin sons. We were having a meeting in the Fillmore, and she came in. She was so pregnant, it was a miracle she got out without having a baby in the meeting. Her husband was then a member of the Nation of Islam. And she says, Shaka, I need names for my babies. And she knew they were going to be boys. And I was just naming our members, giving them African names. And that's when I took on the name Oba Simba Tashaka. So I named both of them and got to meet one of them. So the San Francisco Freedom Movement was really the embryo for Black Studies. The students brought on the strike. Dr. Nathan Hare brought in his brilliance and scholarship that gave birth to the discipline. Later, I would follow him as chair of Black, later Africana Studies. So this is a tribute on behalf of Africana Studies that I made to him. And this picture is a picture of the students at the beginning of the strike shutting down the university, and to the one with his sister with the big natural and her arm over the shoulder, that person is Nathan Hare. And then next to him is a sister named Sharon Jones, who was an 18-year-old student at San Francisco State, got admitted by the Black Student Union, and now teaches as a lecturer at San Francisco State. And we, along with Dr. Dorothy Sharuda, that asked me to write this article on behalf of Africana Studies, as I pointed out earlier in the year, the three of us did a presentation at the National Council for Black Studies in San Jose on the legacy of Dr. Nathan Hare. So I want to read this tribute to Nathan Hare. It's entitled San Francisco State University Department of Africana Studies Statement on the Passing of Dr. Nathan Hare. On June 10th, 2024, Dr. Nathan Hare joined the ancestors. The founders of the greatest civilization in the history of humanity, the civilization of Kemet, known to the world as Egypt, were a people called the Anu. They defined themselves by 3 vertical registers that meant great ones. Who was Dr. Nathan Hare? He was a great one. He was a fearless Black man who fought the enemies of Black freedom and Black truth with his fist, his mind, his writings, his teachings, and through taking political action. By fist, I'm referring to the fact that he was a boxer, and I actually saw fight films when I spoke at Howard University in 1984 when my book, Political Legacy of Malcolm X, came out, and I got to see him in action. He was so fast and throwing his fist that it was funny, and these guys would lay flat in a minute. This is not a part of what I wrote. I'm giving you a little background on this. Just as the Anu founded the greatest classical civilization in antiquity, so Dr. Nathan Hare, as a representative of the best in African American culture, founded the discipline of Black studies in the most alien of spaces, the white college at San Francisco State College, now university, where Black students barely existed and a Black faculty and Black curriculum were non-existent. I had graduated there in 1961 and never saw a single Black faculty person, hardly any Black students. Dr. Hare became the first coordinator of Black studies in the United States and a participant in the successful strike for Black and ethnic studies that gave birth to the Black Studies Department and College of Ethnic Studies in the United States. As a leader of the only successful Black freedom and Black power movement in the North in the 60s to today, the San Francisco Black Freedom and Black Power Movement, and chair of the Afro-American Institute, now Pan-African People's Organization, PAPO, it was my honor every day to walk the picket line of the San Francisco State strike for Black studies. There, Nathan and I became friends. After the strike, Nathan would come by PAPO's headquarters, Pan-African People's Organization, the Malcolm X Unity House, which was its headquarters, and we exchanged ideas on the state of the Black liberation movement and the work we were doing in the movement. And I should point out, this isn't in the article either. Nathan wrote for our newspaper, The African Awakener, and on de-brainwashing. So he was a Black psychologist. Well, he was going to become a Black psychologist. He was then a Black sociologist. What impressed me most about Nathan was the originality of his mind. His thinking wasn't restricted to any ideology. When he co-founded the Black Scholar Journal, which was a very important national magazine, he encouraged it to be a journal of thought that allowed a wide range of Black Black scholarship that caused Blacks to think. When the journal became captured by a dogmatic leftist line, Nathan had to leave. He wasn't going to be a slave to anyone's thoughts. In 1984, Nathan Hare authored a very important book entitled The Endangered Black Family. Dr. Hare had a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago, and he later acquired a PhD in psychology. He did that because he needed to earn a living. This book on the Black family was a seminal work. He was the first scholar to observe that between 1968 and 1984, the Black family had undergone more erosion than between 1619 and 1984. He noted that over 100 years, 75% of Black families had maintained a remarkable unity consisting of two-parent households. By 1984, the time when this book was written by Dr. Nathan Hare, the number had fallen to 50% of Black families were two-parent households. Today, only 29% of Blacks live in two-parent households. A significant part of my writings and the writings of many other scholars on the Black family have addressed this issue first raised by Dr. Nathan Hare. In 1984, I became chair of the Black Studies Department at San Francisco State University, where I had been teaching since 1972. Now, I should note, I did not want to be chair. Ray Richardson dropped that on me. Didn't want to be really holding the hands of Black faculty. I only taught at State to teach and radicalize students and then organize and write and blah, blah. Dr. Hare was fired by Hayakawa at the end of the San Francisco State strike. There's a lot more to this. Subsequently, he was whiteballed from teaching in the US university system. That means he was banned from teaching. Now, I should point out, I didn't point this out in this article, but Nathan told me shortly before his death that he actually had one opportunity to teach in New York, but he turned it down because he wanted to support his wife's career as a radio commentator, Julia Hare. Julia Hare was quite popular and quite verbal, quite a speaker. One of her favorite sayings was, "I want a BMW, a black man working." She could really, rile up an audience. You know what I mean? So Nathan was fired and subsequently whiteballed from university, minus that one thing. The first person I hired when I became chair was Dr. Nathan Hare, the father of Black Studies. I believe in reciprocity. You stand up for right, I'm supporting your ass. You hear me? Even if you're not my friend. And we were friends. But this didn't have nothing to do with friendship. This is principle, you know? The students and faculty of Black Studies were happy to have the master home. Now, he was hired as a lecturer because he wasn't tenured. Tenured is when you're permanent and you can go through the ranks up to full professor, you make more money and all the rest of this stuff. Nathan, teaching was a love of his life, So then something came up. This isn't in the paper, but I'll simply say something came up. There was a hire that I didn't want to do. I had been advised by a person that I had on the committee, a sister who was a good judge of human beings. And if she told me the candidate was no good, I'm not going for him. She was a good reader of people. Professor Don Cece Caillou, one of the two reasons that I taught at San Francisco State. So I wasn't going to hire this person. So I'm giving you background. This is not in the letter. And so I'm approached, I'm not going to say by who, but one of our faculty, and they said, well, we need to hire a blah, blah, somebody I respected. But I said, no, I'm not doing it. And I also had my first wife do the smell test on her. And she also said, she gave me, her reading was superficial. I said, okay. But I had all this pressure coming from the faculty. So I said, okay, this is what's going to happen. I'll support this candidate, who I don't think is worth much, but you all are going to have to line up and support Dr. Nathan Hare for tenure. You hear me? That's what you have to do. So you go back, and all you all come back and tell me that's what you're going to do. So they said they were going to do it. So I hired this other person, and please believe me, the prophecy on her was correct. That's a whole nother story. So once I got the tenured faculty, because those are the faculty that are the ones that are going to make a recommendation for a permanent hire to support Dr. Nathan Hare for a tenure track position, then we put up an ad for sociologists. Now, Dr. Wade Noble's, I'm not reading directly from here. Dr. Wade Noble's partner was a brother named Dr. Lawford Goddard, had a PhD in sociology. And so he applied for this position. But when he understood that Nathan was going to be the candidate, Dr. Lawford Goddard, a sociologist and lecturer in Black Studies, agreed to step aside as a candidate for this position in favor of Dr. Hare. I'm a strategist. I don't run something unless it could really work. And I can give you percentages on chances for something working. And at this point, I had an 80 to 85% chance of getting Dr. Hare tenured, in spite of the fact that the president wouldn't like it. A lot of reasons. Greg Carr. Hey, Greg. Right on. And by the way, brother, give me a call. I need to talk to you. I really appreciate you coming in. Greg Carr, is one brilliant brother, former chair of Black Studies at Howard, and one of the hottest things on the AfroNet, a brother I'm very proud of, who he has a law degree and a PhD from Temple in Africana Studies, and was one of a couple of students, two or three, taken under the wing of Dr. Jacob Carruthers, my master, because they saw a lot in him, in Greg. He's one brilliant brother and a good researcher, hell of a researcher. And you see him on the internet just about every week and on his conversations with Sister Hunter, who has an excellent show. So my strategy for getting Dr. Hare approved for this position depended on surprise. And I had a good chance of getting him recommended by the acting provost, Dr. Eric Solomon, who was an English professor, PhD from Harvard, and had participated in the strike. And as he told me, he had been acting everything except president. So he didn't care 2 cents what Corrigan thought. And I knew with the lineup I could lay on him, we'd get him to recommend it. And then I also knew some things about Corrigan because I kicked his butt as president. And I knew ways that we could get him in. But surprise was everything for this. Unfortunately, the university was tipped off about this recommendation, destroying the chance for success. I won't go into who did it. I immediately informed Nathan of what happened, and Nathan later figured out who was even behind the one that I did not suspect. He just told me that recently. You know, he was a psychologist too, so he had figured something out I hadn't figured out. I knew who had blew it, but there was somebody behind the person that blew it. So that was unfortunate. Nathan and I remained friends. He was supportive of my work. He volunteered to edit my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, which he did. When this book was reviewed by the New York Times, he was the first person who called me telling me that my book had been ranked first against all books on Malcolm X in 2014, New York Times. In 2014, I received a call from a sister who you've seen on the show recently from Jamaica, who was in charge of the national radio station in Jamaica, IRI FM, asking me to speak on Marcus Garvey. Well, it was Nathan who had recommended me. That was Nathan, you know. Nathan was my brother. I had his back and he had mine. For me and for Black folks at large, he was a rare, special human being who stood for the truth and didn't compromise no matter the price. In fact, Nathan almost seemed to want to jam somebody because he just had this natural fighting instinct. He's entered the heavenly station reserved for heroes. Enjoy the heavenly light of freedom that you've earned, my brother. Hotel. So today we're going to honor another hero. The topic for today is the legacy of the great Patrice Lumumba. For those that don't know, he was Prime Minister of the Congo. This show commemorates the 99th birthday of Patrice Lumumba, born July 2nd, 1925, in Onalua, Democratic Republic of the Congo. His birth name was Isai Tashumba Tawosa. Patrice Lumumba. Why commemorate the legacy of Patrice Lumumba? I only have to ask this for someone that may not know who he was, because anyone else will know. Patrice Lumumba was one of the greatest African leaders that rose up at the pivotal period of African independence in the 1960s. I really want to stress this. I'm finishing a book on Seba and Sodaya, which is a replacement system pedagogy, but it's much more than that. It's a transformational system, and it's a critique of Aryan thought. We restrict our critique of Aryan thought to white supremacy, a term I don't use, which is limited. There's a worldview, there's a philosophy that they have. So this book is very much focused on that. And one of the things that I've concluded, especially in dealing with the issue of Seba and Sodaya, the mastery systems of Kemet and the Dogon, is that the greatest classroom that we come into is not the classroom of the four walls. As Nathan Hare said, the community is the classroom. But the greatest classroom of all is the universe. We often say, Ma'at is the rudder of heaven and the beam of earth. What should guide us in life is the truth, Ma'at. And while some scholars, European, will try and separate Ma'at from spirit or anything spiritual, it's the rudder of heaven. Some will say God ingested Ma'at coming out of the noon. Well, that's a nice story, That is Ptah, ingest Ma'at. The truth is God is truth, ultimate truth. God didn't have to ingest anything. God is born as ultimate truth, and God is beauty, beyond all beauty. I have seen this light, and I can tell you the essence of God is beauty, baby. Beauty. The Yoruba, they have a saying, God is such a beautiful force that he's free of all blemish. God, Oludumare, is the one of superlative character. See, in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and among the Hindus, the influence or the main impression is on power. So you get all this, how powerful God is. I've experienced the light. It's enveloped me. And God is a great light, a white light. And what did I feel? The first thing I felt was ultimate beauty. I have never seen beauty like this. And I'm a poet. I'm a lover. A lover of God, my family, my people, of humanity. But that's the essence of God, is beauty, pure beauty. We all pick our time to come here. You don't know this. Some of you may, and most do not. But parapsychology confirms what the Yorubas say. In heaven, we pick our destiny in the presence of God. We pick our time of birth. We pick our parents. We pick the trials we go through in life. Quit talking about God willed this. God's not a Democrat, meaning we're not equal to God. But God gives us more freedom than any democracy ever did, including the Twa, that gave birth to twin linealism, male, female, equal empowerment. They were trying to approximate this beauty, which is God, which is also freedom. God gives us the freedom to do what we want. We pick a choice in heaven, but we come down here. That's why spirits come here, to make choices. 1960, when Patrice Lumumba is picked by the people of Congo to be prime minister, that 1960s is the same time that the Black Freedom Movement kicks off in the United States. Students began sit-ins across the South, 50,000 of them. You hear me? And that had been inspired previously by the Montgomery bus boycott and other struggles that had preceded that. But they launched a Southern-wide movement giving a national character, really a regional character, to the movements of the South. At the same time, African independence movements are kicking off. I'm telling you that when we made choices to come here, in my generation, from my time, those born within this period, we made that choice because there would be an opening in the celestial sphere for Africans to stand up and kick the behinds of the West and secure their freedom in Africa, in the US. The Cubans had done it a few years earlier in Cuba. And 1960 is the time when I walk into CORE and I walk through my destiny door. So I'm telling you that Patrice Lumumba was a man of destiny, as were African people at that time, as we are now. Because if you pick the time to be born where you're going to mature in the 80s and 90s, you pick some real hard times. And you pick those hard times for another reason, because at your age, you're going to have answers to some things we don't have to take us to the next level. So Patrice Lumumba was born at a pivotal period of history where, with the decline of the West, the rise of America as the imperial power, but it would only last for 27 years. They would blow their power in 27 years. The defeat of the West at their own hands through two bloodletting wars. And C.L.R. James, the father of Pan-Africanism, stayed in my house for a week in 1977. And that was to stay so that he could speak at our African Liberation Day. I've shown you a picture of him speaking at it from our newspaper. And C.L.R. James made the best description of these world wars. He called them barbarism. They were barbaric. The European likes to fight. They nearly committed a genetic genocide against each other. And because of that, they weakened themselves to such a point that Britain was broke. It had to give up its colonies. America was pulling its teeth out. They had gone to the bank, that is the gold deposits in South Africa, and started removing them to pay for Lend-Lease when, Roosevelt was giving them so-called aid, and Churchill got on his knees almost and begged them, please stop, please stop. And so then Roosevelt comes up with Lend-Lease, where he's loaning them stuff that they'll get back, which was a pure joke. But the point is, the Americans were now displacing the British as the foremost world power. And that includes in the Caribbean. You hear me? Everywhere. This is what's happening. The son is now taking the place of the father. And so it is in this particular time that an Nkrumah can get away with a movement for positive action, because the West is too weak to resist it. Positive action, peaceful struggle to secure the independence of Ghana, the second independent country in the 20th century after the Sudan in Africa. And he was described by Amilcar Cabral as the genius of African liberation because he could achieve this without hardly any blood being shed. So this opening is an opening that gives the opportunity for Patrice Lumumba to emerge, for the Black freedom movement in the South to emerge, for the San Francisco Black freedom and Black power movement, the only successful one in the country in the 60s to now, to emerge. It was those openings. Had we come 20 years earlier, we couldn't have done that. So that's the cosmos. And so some of us, we came on a destiny ticket where we could choose to be a part of this or not. And Lumumba was a part of that destiny ticket. And obviously, Kwame Nkrumah was one of the greatest giants that has been produced in Africa or the history of the world. A man, a visionary. By the way, a man shaped very much by the African-American view of Pan-Africanism. Learned by him while he's at Lincoln University, but because he's a poor student, he has to work hard, and he's moving through Black communities. One of his degrees was in preaching, the other was economics, so that he was interacting with the Black community, including the study group that John Henry Clark was a part of. And he had him some Black girlfriends, you know what I mean? But he was introduced into Pan-Africanism by the Africans in America and came back a converted Pan-Africanist. And we'll see what he did with this when it comes to Patrice Lumumba. So why Patrice Lumumba? First, he was a man of integrity, and this is the key. Kwame Ture and I were friends. I led the Black Nationalist Wing and Corps, him and SNCC, and afterwards, when I'm in Pan African People's Organization, we'd have him out to speak. We put security on him. I had a bunch of black belts and whatnot, and other belts. He couldn't go anywhere unless our people on him. I never had any security for myself. I don't need any, you know what I mean? But we had it on him. Kwame had him girlfriends. He didn't like having no security on him. I said, yeah, they're not knocking you off on our watch, and hopefully on nobody's watch. And we would have a discussion, and I would always say, Kwame, the first thing about a revolutionary is character, good character. That's the first thing. If you got a lousy character, I don't care what your program is, you're not worth 2 cents. Lumumba had integrity. He was not assuming leadership for himself. He was not out after money. He wasn't perfect. He had some shortcomings. He was young. He was inexperienced. You understand? But he had integrity. He also had brilliance. He was also charismatic, and he was the only leader that was fit to run the Congo, because the colonizers had left only a handful of people who had a college education, which, by the way, I don't think it's a necessary qualification for being the leader of a country, by the way. If you're well-read, if you know what's going on. I mean, a John Henry Clark had no university education. Now, he wasn't a leader, but had he had those qualities, he would have made it fine. And look at Malcolm. Malcolm didn't even graduate from high school. You think he could have run a country? I bet he could. And if you saw the show that I did on revolutionary, Malcolm X and revolution, and I dealt with the Mexican Revolution, and I'm talking about Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa, when they give up Mexico City after they had taken it, which means they had won the revolution, they give it up because they barely knew how to read and write. They had just learned how to read and write. They could read documents, but they said they needed people who could read and write, who could sign documents, and who could meet with foreign officials. That's surface stuff. And if you can read the document. But the key thing is they had read their people. Emiliano Zapata had a program. It came from the culture of the people, communalism, something that Bill Clinton wiped out with NAFTA. You hear me? I made this point. So even if they didn't have a single college-educated person, Lumumba, with his integrity and his brilliance and his overall leadership qualities, would have qualified. The key thing about Lumumba was he was a Pan-Africanist and a nationalist. Malcolm often made the point that Black nationalism, and he was referring at that point to the nationalism of the 60s, it came out of the independence movements of Africa, were the most threatening thing to the European. Later, he would conclude it was the African in America that was the most threatening, because the African in America was strategically located inside this country to pose the greatest threat to America and to world powers. Malcolm had come to that conclusion after being forced out of the nation and beginning to get on the ground and really see things. He could see that we had strategic power in this country. That's why the San Francisco Freedom Movement was so successful. That's why the movement, especially led by King, was so successful. I don't know if King realized the strategic power of Blacks, but he had a strategy that worked. That was the key. You hear me? Strategy is to liberation like food is to your stomach. You hear me? Like love is to any good human being. It's what will get you over, and it will produce victories if you follow them. So we honor Patrice Lumumba and his legacy because he was a Pan-Africanist and a nationalist. He cared about both the people of the Congo and the people of Africa and the people throughout the world in general. And he was standing for freedom. In the most minerally rich country in the world, he wasn't concerned about pocketing money for himself. Kwame Nkrumah made the observation of Lumumba. He said, one of the reasons that he was so important to Congolese independence was, and this was true of Nkrumah as well, is he came from a small tribe. And he was free of tribalism. Now, I'm going to say this on the side. One of Nkrumah's weaknesses was he didn't appreciate enough traditional African governance systems that he could have drawn on more in his own governance of Ghana. Some of us, we put this tribal thing down. Tribe is the European term for African nations, so it ain't so bad to draw from the best features of your nation. One reason why Julius Nyerere, I believe, was the most effective leader on the ground in the 60s in Africa is he came out of the so-called tribal system and was in it long enough to be instilled inside of him that he took the correct path for African independence, which was building up the economy of Tanzania based on agriculture, using the philosophy that came from these so-called tribal societies of ujamaa or communalism or sharing through the family. I'll get into how this ties into some of the stuff that we need to do now in terms of supporting Africa later on. So being too much into the Western system is a problem. And so it's not such a bad thing if you're drawing from the best of your traditional system that Europeans call tribes. They don't call their stuff tribe. That's exactly what it is. Germany, the Germans are a tribe. The French are a tribe. The British are a tribe. The Euro-American is a tribe. We have our own. And because we're mixed up with a whole lot of different ethnic groups, thankfully, there's a common cultural unity that is shared by them. So the key thing about Lumumba was that he wasn't thinking narrowly in terms of favoring one group over the other, be it an ethnic or tribal group or anything else. He thought in terms of African nationalism. So that was the key. Patrice Lumumba's political consciousness was shaped by the Pan-African consciousness of Kwame Nkrumah that had been largely shaped by us. Get that one straight. Now, Nkrumah calls a conference of Accra in Ghana in 1958. And this conference is extremely important because it has a great influence on Patrice Lumumba. Delegates at this conference included Frantz Fanon from Algeria, representing the Algerian movement, Sékou Touré, who would later become president of Guinea, Kenneth Kaunda, who would later become president of Zambia, Joshua Nkomo from the place called then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, Holden Roberto, who was an agent, who later became an agent for the CIA. The point is, this conference that Kwame Nkrumah called in Accra, Ghana, 1958, infected the consciousness of those who attended. And a key person in shaping that conference was George Padmore. real name Malcolm Nurse, who Nkrumah apprenticed under at the Fifth Pan-African Congress. I've told some of you about this before. He wrote a book called Pan-Africanism or Communism. Let me pull this up here. This book right here, Pan-Africanism or Communism. He had been a colonel, the highest ranking African in the Russian system, but broke with the Russians over the issue of nationalism, because with World War II, the Russians were facing the Germans, and they wanted everyone to subordinate, particularly Africans, their interests to Russian interests. And he left the Russian communist operation at that point. But he was an experienced organizer. He was the greatest influence on Nkrumah. John Henry Clark, who I apprenticed under for over 25 years, gave me many accounts of the interaction of Padmore with Nkrumah. The main thing I would get from what John told me is Nkrumah's best years were the years in which he had Padmore at his side. And that does not discount Nkrumah's own ability, because Padmore had the advanced ideas on how to develop Pan-Africanism on the African continent, you know. And Nkrumah, as a Pan-Africanist, was open to Africans from whatever part of the world they came from. So this particular conference had a major effect on Patrice Lumumba. I'm going to quote Kwame Nkrumah. He said, quote, "It was at his memorable conference that the Congolese people had their baptism of fire as apostles of the impending struggle for African liberation." Now, these terms here have got religious overtones: apostles, baptism. Nkrumah had, because his middle name was Francis. And in fact, in the study groups they had with Nkrumah, John and them would jack him up and say, "Man, what you doing majoring in religion? The last thing Africans need is religion." Fortunately, he combined economics and politics. So what he's saying is that the experience that Lumumba underwent attending the Accra Conference in 1958 was a conversion experience, that he got a firm idea of what it meant to lead the Congo to independence. Now, at the same time, on the side later, Nkrumah and Lumumba would reach a secret agreement. And it had to be secret at that time, and it was one that Nkrumah would later reach with Guinea and Sekou Touré, to form a union government between the Congo and Ghana. Now, there's a problem there geographically. You know, you're not going to be able to share common borders and stuff. But it was the idea that Kwame Nkrumah had, that Padmore helped to nurse, and Padmore was from Trinidad, as Kwame Touré was, and that is, along with the US, the two central places in which Pan-Africanism and its ideas were shaped. So this was important. And in fact, Nkrumah signed on to having the Congo as the capital for this union of these two governments. So that's pretty good. And later he would reach the same agreement with Sekou Touré. And later, when he's overthrown, it is Sekou Touré who provides him sanctuary and treats him as a head of state. So this was the idea of one Africa. So this is a key reason that we honor Lumumba, is that he understood that power for Africans could not be achieved through microstates, even though in the case of the Congo, it's a huge piece of real estate and got more resources than any piece of real estate on the planet. But to really be strong, they would have to have the unity and support of Africans on the continent and throughout the world. And so this was also key. So this agreement was an indication again of both Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba's thoughts and commitment to unity. First, the great leader, Julius Nyerere, had the same commitment. He was prepared to postpone the independence of Tanzania and wait for Kenya's independence, because they had they had adjoining borders, or at least they were close to each other, and he wanted to promote African unity. But as Nyerere said, if we didn't get this unity prior to independence, then these leaders are going to be committed to being in charge of their own little piece of land, and they're not going to be thinking about African unity. So the Accra Conference has a major impact on the independence movement in the Congo, because no sooner than Lumumba returns to the Congo, he holds a rally and calls for the independence of the Congo. And then over 33,000 Africans turn out in the streets on their own and create what appears to be, to the colonists, an out of control situation. And what are they demanding? Independence for the Congo. Independence for the Congo. Now, when we finish this, I'm going to go through some of the background of the Congo in terms of how it was exploited. So it wasn't easy for people to just jump up and do that, because the kind of colonialism they faced in the Congo was worse colonialism faced on the continent of Africa. So it's with this challenge that the Belgians are put in a position where they're going to have to take a stand and accept the independence of the Congo. Now, they never really accepted it. They wanted a politically independent Congo with its own leadership, but they would be running things. That's what they really wanted. So what I want to do here is go to the speech of Patrice Lumumba at independence. This is the best one that's out because it's the full speech.
Few speeches have marked our history as much as that given by the Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba on June 30th, 1960, the day the Congo achieved its independence. This speech could be considered the birth of modern Congo, a country that was then emerging from 80 years of colonialism and which looked with confidence to its future. In Africa, this speech is considered one of the key moments in propelling the continent onto the international stage. And in the West, many have seen it as a call to arms, opening up Belgian-Congolese hostilities, plunging this former Belgian colony into chaos. A chaos marked by the fall of the Lumumba government in 1960, and the following year by the assassination of the man considered in Congo to be the country's first national hero.
Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs, une date dont vous enseignerez avec fierté la signification à vos enfants, pour que ceux-ci, à leur tour, fassent connaître à leurs fils et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire glorieuse de notre lutte pour la liberté. La République du Congo a été proclamée et notre cher pays est maintenant entre les mains de ses propres enfants. Ensemble, mes frères, mes sœurs, nous allons commencer une nouvelle lutte, une lutte sublime qui va mener notre pays à la paix, à la prospérité et à la grandeur. Nous allons établir ensemble la justice sociale et assurer que chacun reçoive la juste rémunération de son travail. Nous avons connu les ironies, les insultes, les coups que nous devions subir matin, midi et soir, parce que nous étions des nègres. Qui oubliera qu'à un noir, on disait tu, non certes comme à un ami, mais parce que les voix honorables étaient réservées aux seuls blancs. Nous avons connu que notre fut spolié au nom des textes prétendument légaux qui ne faisaient que reconnaître les droits du plus fort. Nous avons connu que la loi n'était jamais la même, selon qu'il s'agissait d'un blanc ou d'un noir, accommodante pour les uns, cruelle et inhumaine pour les autres. Nous avons connu les souffrances atroces des relégués pour opinion politique ou croyances religieuses. Exilés dans leur propre patrie, leur sort était vraiment pire que la mort elle-même. Nous avons connu qu'il y avait dans les villes des maisons magnifiques pour les blancs et des paillotes croulantes pour les noirs. Que les noirs n'étaient admis dans les cinémas, ni dans les restaurants, ni dans les magasins européens. Que les noirs voyageaient à même la coque de péniche, au pied du blanc dans sa cabine de luxe. Qui oubliera enfin les fusillades où périrent tant de nos frères. Les cachons furent brutalement jetés, ceux qui ne voulaient plus se soumettre au régime d'injustice, d'oppression et d'exploitation. Cette indépendance du Congo, si elle est proclamée aujourd'hui dans l'entente avec la Belgique, pays ami avec qui nous traitons d'égal à égal, ni les Congolais du de ce nom ne pourra jamais oublier cependant que c'est par la lutte qu'elle a été conquise. Une lutte de tous les jours, une lutte ardente et idéaliste, une lutte dans laquelle nous n'avons mélangé ni nos forces, ni nos privations, ni nos souffrances, ni notre sang. Cette lutte qui fit des larmes, des feux et des sang, nous en sommes fiers jusqu'au plus profond de nous-mêmes, car ce fut une lutte noble et juste, une lutte indispensable pour mettre fin à l'humiliant esclavage qui nous était imposé par la force. Ce qui fit notre sort à 80 ans du régime colonialiste, nos blessures sont trop fraîches et trop douloureuses encore pour que nous puissions les chasser de notre mémoire. Quand nous avons connu le travail harassant, exigé en échange de salaires qui ne nous permettaient ni de manger à notre faim, ni de nous vêtir ou nous loger décemment, ni d'élever nos enfants comme des êtres chers. Hommage aux combattants de la liberté nationale. Vive l'indépendance et l'unité africaine. Vive les Congo indépendants et souverains.
That was a hard speech to find because most of them are interpretations of the speech and everything else. I should say that prior to Lumumba giving his speech, the King of Belgium spoke and had the nerve to talk about how they had brought civilization to the Congo, and that the Congolese shouldn't do anything to change what the Belgians had done unless it was better. Now, the truth of that is you could go to sleep and do better, because what the Belgians did was the most brutal form of oppression faced by Africans anywhere on the African continent. It was the worst system of colonialism. And so I just want to deal with that first and then get back into Lumumba himself. I want to take some of the background that he's referring to and put some history to it. He talked about how they had fought for their freedom. He talked about how they were seeking social justice, justice between African men and African women, how they had faced insults and contempt, that there were two laws, one for whites, one for blacks. We know that. We had the same thing here. He talked about how the whites lived in mansions and the Africans lived in shacks. He talked about how the struggle for the liberation of the Congolese people was a noble struggle. And he basically was complimenting his people for standing up and fighting. And this had been years of fighting, not just something that had occurred overnight. So I just want to briefly put this in a historical context, and then go back into Lumumba and his legacy. The Congo had existed for a long time as a powerful kingdom. In 1490, the Congo was ruled by Amani Congo, the king of the Congo, M-A-N-I. And it was a free country and had great wealth and great power. What happens with the beginning of the decline and fall of Moorish power in Spain is that the Portuguese are able to gain some knowledge of Africa. They began to do map making and to discover the African continent. And what begins to happen is that they begin to move into the Congo, starting with their movements. Starting in 1490, they start in Ghana and other places, and then they end up in the Congo. And so the Portuguese come in and establish a relationship with the Mani Congo, the king of the Congo. The king of the Congo is independent. The powers are about equal between Portugal and the Congo. And the king of the Congo is looking for ways to improve his kingdom. And so he wants to get some of the improvements that would come from the West. And so they enter into a relationship. And so this relationship ends up being tragic. But the intention of the Mani Congo was in the beginning good. What he wants to do is modernize, get more technology and stuff into his country. But what ends up happening is, what becomes confused here is culture and modernization. In Africa, when you have the coming of the missionaries that come later, There's a whole history to this. Some Africans who become Christians, I've gone through this before. I'm not going to go into the details. It's much different than most people think. They confuse Christianity and industrialization. They think that if you're going to get one, you have to have the other. And that's because of their peculiar experience under the slave trade, where they've been enslaved by some of their own people who then send them to the Europeans. And when slavery is abolished by the British, then one of the things they do is begin to free Africans up around Liberia and Sierra Leone. These Africans go into Sierra Leone and Liberia, and they begin to take on Christianity and a vision of how Africa could progress through industrialization. Some Africans come back from Brazil and other parts of the world where they had been enslaved, and they come with the same idea. They are under a system of alienation where their own kings had betrayed them, and so they see the people who freed them, who actually were the ones who were running the slave trade from the beginning, as partners, as friends. And this is before the era of colonialism in Africa. And so what they end up doing is beginning to advocate for Christianity and the European nation state. And much of Africa's independence leaders come out of this miseducation background. Now, what's happening in the Congo is a little different, because this isn't the period of proselytization that would come later, prior to colonialism carried out by the Europeans, but this is the Portuguese establishing a relationship with the Mani Congo. And so the king of Congo is seeking certain improvements for his people. But what he ends up getting is Christianity. He makes the mistake of converting to Catholicism, and eventually sending his children to Portugal, who are going to get further miseducation. But he's hoping for things that produce modernization. He's one of the earliest examples of the fact that when you modernize, you do not take on the culture of your enemies. And it wasn't his intention, but that's what he ends up being sucked into. And so what do the Portuguese insist on? They insist on that in exchange, because what the Portuguese end up doing is coming in with what's called the Regimento, Regimento of 1512. And that's bringing the Constitution of the Portuguese to the Congolese. That's the last thing they need. Africans gave birth to democracy, for example, and, Europeans have no idea of what that is, And of course, the Mani Congo, he himself isn't a Democrat, but the people at the village level are all over Africa. They don't need that. And they're living prosperously. Yeah, they could upgrade some things. You know what I mean? So what ends up happening is, in exchange for a regimento, which is a constitution that is based on how Portugal is run, and Catholicism, the King of Portugal has the nerve and gets away with it to say, we want something in exchange. You're getting nothing. So what should you get in exchange? And what does he say he wants? Ivory, copper, or slaves? And so this king makes the mistake of giving them that, especially slaves, a couple of hundred in the beginning. But not long after that, the king wants to bow out because he sees that his people are being enslaved, they're losing their freedom. And so he demands that this end. By this time, the Portuguese are in the Congo well enough that they can play one part of his kingdom against the other. And so some chief and some village will go along with this, even though the Mani Congo's opposed to it. And so this is the beginning of the colonization process in the Congo. And then in 1877, the explorer Morton Stanley arrives at the mouth of the Congo. Stanley proposes that the King of Belgium, Leopold II, use the Congo as a place where he can exploit the people and the wealth of the Congo. Now, Morton Stanley's an American, by the way. And so the King of Belgium says, in effect, that I've been looking for this opportunity, and he grabs it. And so what's different about the Congo from the colonization of other parts of Africa is, whereas the enslaved were taken out of Africa into Brazil, into America, the Caribbean, and then later colonialism, the European comes in and, runs the country. But what's happening here is the Congo, the people are enslaved in the Congo. This is different. You hear me? This is different. And so what you have established in the Congo is slavery in the Congo. And the personal fiefdom of the Congo is in the hands of Leopold. It's his personal fiefdom. And so what he ends up doing is bleeding the Congo of everything. And so he brings in poor whites from Portugal and from Europe and gives them a task to bring in Africans from the inner villages, arm them, and put them into different villages and force the people into slave labor. Force them into the forest and whatnot to extract rubber. And if they don't bring enough, an arm is cut off, a leg is cut off. And if the poor whites don't succeed in what they do, they can get some of the same thing to them. And so he sets up a brutal system of exploitation. And the Africans who are brought in armed, and sometimes it's the whites who go into the villages, they can have whatever woman they want, whatever they have. And because they have the guns, they're able to impose it on the people. And so as a result of this, the population of the Congo is destroyed. This is truly genocide. And it is this system that Lumumba is exposing and saying that we're ending this, that this kind of oppression is going to stop. And you see, Lumumba was given it straight, no chaser. His independence speech is telling you straight up, we're not going to be your monkeys anymore. Mao would give a similar speech on his independence, that the Europeans are not going to be able to come in and walk over us anymore. They called the Europeans devils. And so this is the nature of what Patrice Lumumba is faced with, a country that is minerally the richest on the planet, that had been sacked and exploited. And it is this that they're recovering from. And it is these forces that are going to be manipulated as Lumumba comes to power. So when we look at the independence of the Congo and Lumumba's statement of independence in 1960, we have to look at, so what's the United States position on Africa and on the Congo? What's the position of the key leadership in the United States on Africa? Now, The common view the common view is that Eisenhower basically is opposed to Lumumba and orders his assassination. Basically, that's the common view. And the common view is that Eisenhower said that Lumumba had insulted his friend, who was the king of Belgium. And Eisenhower definitely was supportive of the Europeans in their pursuit of African resources and everything else, and was mainly concerned about Africans being exploited by the United States under U.S. rule. So Eisenhower has a number of views on Lumumba. In fact, at first, writers say that Eisenhower believed that Lumumba was communist, and that that was really what was driving things with the relationship of the U.S. to Africa, and particularly to Lumumba. In fact, Eisenhower, of course, had the same views as Europeans generally had of Africa. And that view was a very low view of Africa. So his view was that African independence for him was a disaster. He called it an African destructive hurricane. This was Eisenhower's view of what African independence meant. A high official in the State Department, Assistant Secretary of State Burke Elbrick, when speaking before the Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1958, he said, quote, this was generally the view of the State Department on African independence. Quote, he said, premature independence and irresponsible nationalism may present grave danger to dependent peoples. In other words, just as they viewed us as people that need to be under the hammer, Africa was best under the hammer. Eisenhower was basically a do-nothing political president. His contribution was that he had gone against the policy of the previous president, Truman, who had intervened in the Korean War and enabled America to face their first defeat. The first defeat was not Vietnam. It was when Mao ran the Marines and the Army out of the 38th parallel because he had warned them, if you cross it, I will send troops against you. Now, this is some little side history I'm going to give you here. I'm an expert. Well, I'm not an expert, but I studied China. As I told you before, I took my wife, her and I went on our honeymoon to China, 2011, my second wife, Pamela Hurley Tashaka. And so I get a chance to exchange scholarship with the scholars because the tour people are graduates of universities and they have excellent knowledge of history. They're historians. They just can't get jobs in universities and stuff. And so I share with him what actually happened in Korea. The Cold War has come, And this is another story I won't go into, but it was a myth. It was BS. Russia was no threat to the US or to the world. They had lost 27 million people. They had saved the West from, the Germans and from Nazism. But Truman constructs NATO and everything else on this, and then he intervenes in the Korean War. And he has MacArthur, who's in his 70s, who had been one of the best generals America had, but he was over the hill, And so when he asked MacArthur, if you go across the 38th parallel, will Mao do anything? He said, no. Yeah, really? Are you kidding? So my research showed that Mao and Stalin had reached an agreement. Mao wanted the atom bomb and would eventually get it from the Russians. And the deal was, and I ran this past the Chinese scholars and they accepted this. They hadn't heard of this, but it made sense to them. The deal was that if Mao could give America a bloody nose, Stalin would give Mao secret to the atom bomb. America's never been smart enough to figure this one out, because I'm a strategist. I'm asking, why did the Russians stay away from the Security Council meetings in which they could have stopped the US from using the United Nations for interference in Korea? They could have still gone in on their own, but not with United Nations support. Why? And this was the why. It was a bloody nose. Stalin was PO'd with how he was being treated by the Americans. So this was his indirect way of delivering a message. So when I give this message to the Chinese in China, who are scholars, they said, yes, that makes sense, except it took a couple of years for them to get the bomb. Yeah, I'm sure Stalin had to really think about that one. You know what I mean? But that was the story. So the point is, Eisenhower, when he comes into office, his position is let Asians kill Asians. That was his position. He's a former 5-star general in charge of the invasion in Normandy, in charge of the Allied forces who are doing mop-up, because the Russians have already won World War II, contrary to popular opinion. And so what's happening then is, Eisenhower is presiding over this invasion. So Eisenhower concludes when he becomes president, he's not getting involved in these ground wars. So that's his great contribution, is that they didn't have a war, but he presides over the murder of 1 million people in Indonesia. There's a whole lot of skullduggery going on while Eisenhower is in office, but none that was going to bloody his hands. Eisenhower sits through the Black Freedom Movement of Montgomery and does nothing. He's angered and disappointed when the Supreme Court appointee that he puts on the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, who is Supreme Court Justice, who he puts on thinking that he'll maintain a good conservative position since he threw Japanese in concentration camps, and he comes up with Brown versus the Board of Education for desegregation of the public school. This is definitely not what Eisenhower wanted. And Eisenhower only reluctantly federalizes the National Guard to protect Black children who are desegregating schools in Little Rock. So what was Eisenhower's view of African independence? Let me quote him from his own biography. It is, quote, a destructive hurricane. I wish that was true. On your house, not Africa's house. But that's his view. You hear me? That's Eisenhower. When Eisenhower is meeting with the colonial countries of Europe, he goes to Portugal. As I've noted, a vicious colonizer of both the Congo and of the Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau. And while visiting Portugal, he has the nerve to praise Portugal for, quote, its contribution to civilization. Well, now, this is appropriate because America's, that's their notion of civilization. As Arnold Toynbee said, America is the only society that's gone from savagery to barbarism without experiencing one day of civilization, except I would modify it and say it's not the only one. The Australians and many others, wherever you had a settler colony, you have genocide. That's what the Zionists are doing right now against the Palestinians. Systematic genocide. You hear me? And when in Portugal, he meets with the dictator Salazar and asks for U.S. aid so he can kill Mozambicans, Angolans, and people from Guinea-Bissau. And Eisenhower's response is, quote, "We are unified in a common cause." Okay, a common cause. Yeah, NATO, under American auspices, provides arms to Portugal. You hear me? Now, there's a book called JFK, Ordeal in Africa. The author, David Mahoney, he is a person who has some views on what the U.S. government's position was on the Congo. So what happens when the Congolese gain their independence? Almost immediately, the Belgians manipulate a situation where Katanga declares its independence, a minerally rich province of the Congo. Even though they had promised to stay out of the affairs of the Congo, they still had a military presence and kept building that military presence up. And what ends up happening then is Lumumba, who was prime minister of the Congo, and his president, a man named Kasavubu, called on the United Nations for intervention in the Congo, which happens. And so at this point, you have a struggle between Lumumba and then forces that are trying to break the Congo apart, basically the Portuguese, with the United States not doing anything to stop it. Now, the U.S. supports the occupation of United Nations forces, and Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, brings in a military force to be a part of that, and he brings in a general. His general is a white South African who he eventually is going to have to get rid of. But the point is, to prevent the Congo from falling apart, there needs to be this intervention, because at this point, it is not in the power of Lumumba's government. He has some army, but the army is weak. I see Alexandria White says, when compared to China's successful decolonization, it sounds like the key to true African independence will involve building up its military power and war capability. China was never colonized. It faced semi-colonialism on the borders. They didn't have the occupation of all of China. If they did, China would not be standing up right now. You hear me? China would be undergoing what we're undergoing. China had civil war. And what ended up happening is civil war between warlords, civil war between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, and America supported the Kuomintang, which is now what was formerly called Formosa Taiwan, which America is threatening war if China reunifies Taiwan, which they eventually will. So the decolonization, that ain't what China faced. You can't use China as a model. We are faced with something different because of the heavy imprint of European colonialism and slavery and 100 years of resistance to it prior to that. And so it's going to take us longer to recover from that. China will not provide a model for that. And I have some things to say about China in a minute that some of you may be surprised by and others may not. But that's a good observation. And reparations is fine, but reparations is not going to be your full liberation. If you think some money in the bank is, then go look at Hitler. The Jews had a lot of money in the bank. And what happened? When they stuck them in concentration camps, they went after their gold teeth before they smoked them, in gas chambers. And if you all don't realize that this election that's coming up has a promise of fascism behind it, and if you're going to get all intellectual about, well, what is fascism? Or what's one election from another? You should know, if you know power, you should know the difference of what's serious and what isn't. If you have a headache, it's one thing. If you have a heart attack, it's another. Project 2025 is an orchestrated plan to turn this place into a fascist operation, and a sector of big business doesn't have a problem with it. That sector that's promoting Trump. And so you better understand what you're faced with right now is something you better stop. And if anybody thinks I'm for Biden, it looks like Biden's going to have to step down. It ain't about, I ain't for this or for that. I'm for us winning. And in this particular case, getting the heat up off our head. That's another story. I went into this in one show, but there's others that will deal with this in more detail. So what's happening then is Patrice Lumumba is faced with a fragmentation situation, and he's trying to use the United Nations as a protective force. Yeah, I'm glad that you're sharing Project 2025. I'm glad. So one of the things then that Lumumba does is he is trying to make some moves, and he goes to Washington to try and get support from the Eisenhower administration. And this is a smart move. Eisenhower doesn't meet with him, but he meets with lower level officials. So while it is true that Eisenhower ordered the assassination of Lumumba later, that was not his position in the beginning. In the beginning, prior to Lumumba's trip to Washington, July 25th, 1960, Lumumba had granted a 50-year contract to an American-owned Congo International Management Corporation owned by a man named Edgar Detwiller, Detwiler. I do research for this, by the way. This takes time. And, I hope some people will do some support for this show financially, because I've been paying for this show now going on 4 years, and I could use a little support. I know some people have provided, and we had some problems with some people getting their stuff through because we hadn't had the system up. We do now. Gregory Jones says reparations will come when we have developed, implemented a balance of power. At that point, the government will be interested in negotiating on agreement better than the loss they will experience. Yeah, when we have the power to do it. Balance of power, I guess that's what you mean. Yeah, right, in terms of reparation. And Kurt Thomas, how do you overcome the Aryan will to have everything? I'm a philosopher, but first I'm a warrior. It doesn't matter what an enemy wants. It's what you have the power to grant or deny. And so that's a question of power. And America is going down the tubes. The reason that you have this Supreme Court decision that's come out, that's basically saying that a president can be a dictator. The reason that you've had these decisions that have weakened the authority of agencies to protect the environment. It's what you call Custer time. It's white people's last stand. The reason that Trump and them have stolen a lot of votes, meaning passed laws and stuff to prevent a lot of blacks from voting. It's to stack the deck, because in less than 20 years, a majority in this country will be black, brown, red, and yellow. But most of you don't appreciate what that means because you don't know what power is. If you do, you rolled up your sleeves, you got in some movements, and you scored some victories. You don't even know the value of what Black Lives Matter produced in chasing what? Trump out of the White House. You don't know. You know what I mean? So you need to get powerful, get in a group that's doing something for the liberation of African people. Get in that. And so axiology and the Aryan always wants it all. Yeah, they always wanted it all, and they fought each other over it, and they went into complete decline in World War II. America has fallen. America was the preeminent power from 1945 to 1972. In 27 years, they lost their power. China has displaced America as the economic power of the world. China today, Africa tomorrow. And the African in America is going to have power to the extent that we rebuild our communities, rebuild our families, and build on the power that we as a people have developed. And quit listening to nonsense, which I know people watching this show don't. Going to put down African unity. Give me a break. Huh? You see any Europeans putting down European unity? Who in the world puts down unity for their own people? That's putting down your own power. So what happens is, in the beginning, Eisenhower has a positive appraisal of Lumumba because he's granted a 50-year contract to an American-owned Congo International Management Corporation owned by Edgar Detwiller. Under the terms of the contract, Detwiller was granted exclusive right to exploit the Congo's mineral and hydroelectric resources. Do you know what that's like? For a capitalist, that's like heaven. You're giving them everything. So Eisenhower felt good. See all this bull that's written on Eisenhower and how he was opposed to Lumumba because he had insulted his friend. Presidents are about the business of America, which is business. They're about promoting American business. And I want to say this about your current president, Biden. The presidents of the Congo and Zambia reached an agreement where they were going to produce the first electric car, or a car period, in Africa. And Biden intervened and said, no, they should work with America on this. Tell Biden to go to hell. And if you don't think Trump will do that, he'll do more than that. In fact, to this day, it has been the project of the West to see that industrialization doesn't occur in Africa. Well, it is the project for African leaders to do it on their own. And of course, it would be better to use solar energy, wind, not industrial exploitation, because it, promotes the heating of the planet, But the key point is that what Lumumba was faced with was how's he going to run this country? And in the beginning, he makes this concession. So when he makes this concession, Eisenhower is okay. But Eisenhower changes his position on Lumumba on July 26, 1960. See, I'm giving you precise dates. When Lumumba, under pressure from other African nations, ends the agreement with Detwiller and the management corporation owned by him. And Eisenhower then concludes that if he ends this, because the other thing Eisenhower felt good about Lumumba was that Lumumba had not expelled the Rockefeller and Morgan family from the Congo. And they controlled the banking system, which meant they really controlled the country. Eisenhower concludes that when Lumumba changes his position, because he comes under pressure from African nations to stop this, Eisenhower concludes that, well, the banks are going to go next. And so where the money goes, the honey goes. So the propaganda books on Eisenhower all talk about how he's disturbed by Lumumba insulting the king of Belgium. They don't like his deportment when he comes to Washington, D.C. All of this stuff. Nah, it's right after American financial interests are threatened that Eisenhower signals to the CIA, kill him. Presidents never order assassinations. They do like the signifying monkey. They signify. And so the head of the CIA said, oh, it surprised me that he said this. Like hell, that's what the CIA is there for, to kill people. I know, they tried it with me. 2 from the FBI, 1 from the CIA. And you say, how'd you do that? See, you're supposed to sacrifice yourself. Like hell, my philosophy is sacrifice you, not me. Are you crazy? You hear me? So there's a lot of machinations. There's the attempt to send some poison to get to him. He's got security coming from the United Nations. That doesn't happen. The CIA enters in some contracts with the mafia. They can't do it, right? But in the end, he's executed. He's murdered. And then it appears that his body is destroyed in acid. And then later, Mobutu, who becomes head of the Congo, has the nerve to build a statue to Lumumba and to proclaim him a national hero of the Congo. And then what you have is kleptocracy under Mobutu. Kleptocracy is a system where the leader takes everything. Now, he didn't take everything. He took the crumbs. The corporations took everything. And that is the case today. So today in the Congo, you have resource wars going on. Millions of Congolese have died. And one of the forces in this that's playing a role in this are the Chinese, who have their own mining interests in the Congo. And I'll deal with this in a minute. So this is the state of the Congo today. The New York Times, the major media, does not cover what's happening in the Congo. And it is basically the corporations that are running the show and presidents who are executing it. And neighboring states, Rwanda, Uganda, and others who are getting their pound of flesh and ripping people off, and the leadership that is corrupt to the core. So this is the state of the Congo today. The Congo and the rest of Africa is going to need leadership on the level of the visionaries of Nkrumah, of Lumumba, of Cabral, and of others. And they will arise. And what they need from us is our support. The role of the African in America is to use our strategic position to support Africa in their struggle. And that will not come from the Congressional Black Caucus or caucus, who are owned lock, stock, and barrel by the corporations. It's going to come from the grassroots. It's going to come from us supporting principled leadership like Patrice Lumumba, and others who are trying to do good for Africa. This is a picture of me, the big natural. This is 1973. I'm chairing the Pan-African People's Organization. Now, and I'm meeting with the Chinese ambassador to Tanzania. And we've just had a 2-hour meeting. And in fact, the person to his side is Simba Tayari, who is our representative in Tanzania at that time, who spoke Swahili fluently. And in that meeting, I jacked this ambassador up. I asked him, what the hell is China doing arming Mobutu? Because at this time, they were providing guns to Mobutu. And his answer was, well, these are revolutionary guns we're giving them because it comes from China. Give me a break. You're in there to get resources. And that's basically what the Chinese are doing right now in the Congo, is getting their share of rare resources that are used mainly in computer technology industries and other industries. So just as we need to get Western corporations out of Africa and the Congo, we need to get the Chinese ones out as well. In this case, the Chinese government. Now, I really want to stress this. If you're not in an organization and you're not doing something to uplift your people, and all you're doing is talking and reading, which is good to read, and it's good to talk, to share ideas, then you're not talking about building power. Pan-African People's Organization, which I still chair, in the 1970s, we were working, and we still do, with African leaders. This is a meeting, informal discussion. That's me with the natural on. Sitting next to me is David Sebeko. David Sebeko was the leader of the Pan-African Congress in South Africa. He was second only to Mandela in leadership in Africa. And he would come to our headquarters, Malcolm X Unity House, and speak. We were then organizing African Liberation Day, averaged 29,000 people a year for about 6 years, providing supplies and support for the armed struggles in Africa. And when he spoke at one of our African Liberation Days, he made this comment: we come here on the bridge built by Malcolm. But I would add, the bridge built by the Pan-African movement, starting with Sylvester Williams in 1900 and carried out by Du Bois between the 1900s and 1945. And then by the Fifth Pan-African Congress and by Garvey that preceded that, and by the freedom fighters in this country who have always reached out to Africa, like King and others, and groups like the Pan-African People's Organization. So we collaborated and offered support to each other. And this was a meeting we had in London on our way. I'm with a delegation of 10 people, including myself and my first wife, Anasa Tashaka, to work in the Ujamaa villages of Tanzania. And so we have a meeting with him. While we're in Tanzania, after working 3 months in these villages, I've gone through this before, I lost 15 pounds working in these villages. We then met with the liberation movements that were then carrying out armed struggles that we had provided material support to. So this is one, SWAPO, Southwest African People's Organization. This is the group that would end up producing the independence of Namibia in Southwest Africa. And the brother that's in front of me, the back, that's me with the red on, the one in the t-shirt, that's Ajili Hodari, who was a leader in Pan-African People's Organization. He had been a graduate of Michigan State and football player, and he tried out for the 49ers and didn't make it. And so they gave him a check, and he ended up in San Francisco, and we recruited him into Papo. Now, this is an amazing brother who ends up later, goes back. He's with Papo for some time, goes back to Michigan State, gets a law degree, and he's married, and he ends up having a bunch of children, one of whom becomes an engineer going to West Point, another one who becomes a medical doctor, another who becomes an architect, a daughter who gets a degree in computer technology at Stanford University, and then an advanced degree at Harvard. This is Ajili. I named him sharp-minded. One bad brother. So what we're doing here is collaborating with the liberation movements. This is a chair of the party in Tanzania, in a village in Tanzania, because we worked in villages for 3 months across Africa. And this is our meeting with Zimbabwe African National Union. And we had a member, Kamburi Kangai, and this is me meeting with the ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union representative. That's me right there, that's him. And we're exchanging views on how we can support each other in our common struggles, not just us supporting Africa, them supporting us. One of our leading members was a brother named Kamburi Kangai. Kamburi Kangai was a medical student at UC San Francisco and would later get his medical degree and would go back to Zimbabwe and would become the second most important leader in Zimbabwe next to Mugabe. He was a member of Pan-African People's Organization. And then his brother went to San Francisco State and got a degree in media and was in charge of the media of Zimbabwe, and then later ambassador to China and ambassador to Zambia. Now, what am I saying here? As we're organizing our people around our basic needs, we need to be at the same time extending support to those elements in Africa that are moving forward in a positive way. We need to use the power that we build here to also put pressure on this government to provide support in a positive way for African people and African governments. And that is the key. And the same with the Caribbean. We need a strong force in this country to support Haiti, a strong force that gets America out of Haiti. And we have the power to do that if we corral the right forces to do it. And so we have this key thing that we have to build, which is Pan-Africanism, as we're building power in this country. And this is an example here of how we were building relationships. This is prior to the Sixth Pan-African Congress that occurred in 1974. I chaired the political committee for North America to the Sixth Pan-African Congress. This was a meeting with the ambassador from Tanzania. We're forging relationships with governments, and one of the leaders in our group, Thabiti Mtambuzi, is continuing to do this work in Tanzania and in Zanzibar, where he had a guest house and he's building a new one right now. Thabiti is one of the brilliant students that I recruited into Papo. He's in his 70s. He's a multimillionaire. Told me he would be when he was a student. He was Associated Student Body President at San Francisco State. He's into real estate. And all of his children have gone through our school, African Children's Advanced Learning Center. So we've maintained a relationship with Tanzania since the 70s. This is a very important picture here. In the center, the brother with the black coat on, that's Ambassador Paul Bomani, ambassador from Tanzania. He's at the Malcolm X Unity House. He's in the picture in back of him is Marcus Garvey. It's called Marcus Garvey Hall. It was a 5,900 square foot building that I bought, put the down payment on, and then our members contributed to paying the monthly mortgage until we paid it off. So we're here strategizing before the 6th Pan-African Congress. To what's my left, you see the sister with the African outfit on. That's the mother of the San Francisco Freedom Movement, Ella Hill Hutch, the person who was my mother's best friend, who is a key reason that I'm in the movement, that recruited me into CORE. She's a founder of CORE. I want to stress, Pan-African People's Organization is an outgrowth of the Congress of Racial Equality. We took it to the next stage while we dealt with mass organizing, getting jobs for thousands of people, building housing, organizing block by block, a whole bunch of things. Pan-African People's Organization went to the level of institution building, building independent Black schools, building other institutions, providing free food or food for 25 cents a meal for our people, free clothes, fighting against police brutality, and a host of other things. And so this was the extension of CORE into PAPO. It's your organizational base that determines your power. One of the things that Lumumba had to deal with is because of those centuries of colonialism, which was really slavery, then they didn't have the opportunity to build up institutional infrastructures. They were doing that through the independence movement in the Congo. It's these structures that we have to have. To the right of that, you'll see that's me. And then the sister next to me, that's my first wife, Anasa Tashaka, who was very active in the Black Freedom Movement. She has passed on now. She ran our food program. She had been a straight A student. As a student, she took part in our trips to Tanzania, working in the villages, hours and hours of hard work. I've shown some of that before. So I want to conclude by saying that we honor the best of us when we honor the great Patrice Lumumba, a man of integrity, a man of vision. And it's our task to take this to the next level. We're in a state of disarray. Communities have been turned upside down. They have to be rebuilt. We have to make the right choices around the culture that we will draw from. And while it is important to deal with Afrocentricity, we need to draw from the best of new African culture as well. This has been a weakness of the African-centered scholars. They have not studied, for the most part, the culture of Africans in America. And that puts us in a weak position because that is the basis for our liberation, along with the best that comes from ancient Kemet and from ancient Africa and from Africa today, you know? So we have a task to build power. And the task now is to be a part of something that makes sure Trump doesn't get to the White House and we stick him in the doghouse. And I really want to compliment the Blacks who have been the ones who have had the nerve to go up against Trump and prosecute him. Yeah, I'm not into, being a district attorney. I was in law school for 2 years and decided I want to be a lawyer. But hell, if you're going to prosecute somebody, prosecute the real criminals. And I want to take my hat off to Brother Bragg. Right on, brother. You did a good job. Yeah, it was the weakest of charges that could be brought against Trump, but 34 felonies? And the way you used your little old Harvard education to link them together and turn them into felonies? Yeah, right on. And you got a sister lined up that wants to get her teeth into them, and others in the Supreme Court trying to give them cover. You're the answer. Your culture is the culture of popular choice of this country and the world. And what we need to do is use this culture to build Black power. Hotep. Let's see what y'all got to say. Brother Ugawa, Black women inspire their power in the community is often undermeasured and sometimes underappreciated. Yeah, that's true. The 60s, the sisters didn't get their proper dues, but right now they are. I mean, Black Lives Matter is one example, and many other movements, the movements around voting in the South, those have been sister-led. Why? Because in the fragmentation of Black families, sisters have come in and filled the gap. And so they're assuming a lot of leadership, as they should, and we need to support them. Ikabo Kilombo, totally agree with you when you say that all that talking and reading without action, without being in an organization means nothing. Yeah, it's one of the things that makes me question, am I going to continue to do this? Are y'all doing anything? You know what I mean? That's a key thing. Get off the grass and do something. Brother Ugawa, is China practicing a more diplomatic form of imperialism in Africa? One using economics as a more covert form of control rather than directly ruling states. We always have to question how we see things. You know what I mean? If you have a powerful view of things, then you will see it one way, and if not, you'll see it another way. So China, when it comes to the world, doesn't have a history of colonialism. Whether they will do it in the future, I'm not a prophet and can't tell, but I can say in Southeast Asia, yeah, they've exercised spheres of influence. You know, they considered themselves the Middle Kingdom since they had so many people. They were satisfied with that, though they tried to impose their power over Vietnam and the Vietnamese. As soon as they withdrew a few people, the Vietnamese rose up and reestablished their independence. What I would say is China is pursuing a perfect strategy. They call it win-win. That's Sun Tzu. It's one that I pursued many times, winning a war without fighting. America's fighting all the wars and losing, but even if they won, what's the victory? What was the victory in Vietnam? What was the victory in Iraq and Afghanistan? You already had the oil. You know, Afghanistan, a place that only dummies go. The Pentagon didn't have a plan for Afghanistan. They figured no president would be stupid enough to go in there. Then you had George Bush. So the Chinese, and their strategy is they have brought in infrastructure. They built things in exchange for what they want, which is resources. And so the question for Africa is, how do you take those resources and use it for your development? If you have corrupt leaders in power, then they're not taking the chance or the opportunity that is provided, right? In the case of the Congo, they need to be put out, and they should not have a single military base in Africa, and they have one. They shouldn't have any. So if you come from a position of weakness, you'll say, yeah, this is new colonialism. China is pursuing their own interests, and they're getting something for it, but Africa's getting something in exchange, and that something is much better than what they get from the West. So if they use those resources that are brought in, including money, then they could use that for their own development. China had cheap labor that, you know, they gave Western corporations in their country. You could say the Western corporations were exploiting China. Yeah, that was their goal. And China ended up on top. They used those corporations. They used those industrial systems and took them over and now outproduce the United States and Europe. You know what I'm talking about? So it's a question of how you use that. Let's see, what else do we have here? Thanks for the compliments. Lao Tzu. What did Lumumba think the result of his actions were going to be? Wasn't he naive? No, Lumumba was not naive. He was impulsive. He was young. He made a few tactical mistakes, you know, but overall, he was in a very difficult position because he's in a place that everybody wants, the resource rich Congo, the most resource rich piece of real estate on the planet. So, no, he wasn't naive. Inexperienced, yeah, you know what I mean? Hey, you're young. This was his first experience at wielding power, but he made some good moves, but it was difficult, very difficult. Question. Civil rights are what we use to navigate this oppressive system. Human rights are transcendent and go beyond what the oppressors can do. Remember, the people in the Black freedom movement never defined their movement as a civil rights movement. We defined it as a Black freedom movement. System defined it as civil rights. And King reached the point by 65 where he saw the movement had reached the stage of human rights. The same conclusion Malcolm reached, but King's was more practical because he was on the ground fighting. Malcolm was just getting in the water. So Malcolm wanted to charge the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and everyone else, charge America with violating our human rights and genocide. So that was his strategy. The problem with that strategy is you're going to the organizations that the U.S. set up and they have a veto over. So, yeah, it's interesting. But King's strategy was, by human rights, he meant we had moved beyond the Constitution, which grants civil rights, the right to vote and so forth, the right to free speech and so forth, the right to public assembly and so forth. And he said, so we got the right to vote. We got public accommodations bills so that we could end formal legal apartheid, which the Supreme Court is doing their best to reverse. He said that was cheap, but now we need to move to the point of human rights. What did he mean? Economic empowerment. A guaranteed income for people, for example. Something which, by the way, Nixon had in his budget and the Democrats voted down because he had bought into the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson. He was continuing them because he was a foreign policy president. He wasn't that interested in domestic policy. So that was going to end welfare. But unlike what Clinton did, everybody below a certain income was going to get an income boost, a guaranteed annual income. With artificial intelligence, you're going to have that. And that guaranteed income needs to go up to at least $60,000 to $70,000 to $80,000. And it's a year. That's easily done. The reason they're not doing it is everything going into the defense and into the pockets of the rich. And this is reform, by the way. I'm a revolutionary, but I also deal with reform because it's the precondition for more radical change. So King's idea also was restructure the society. That is, of course, human rights up the yin yang because that's revolutionary. Kurt Thomas, thanks for the comment, brother. See a little humor there. Gregory Jones, as the U.S. loses power globally, white nationalism will focus its anger on those that have identified as the problem domestically. Yeah, so what do? You got to build power, baby. You want to build power? If you build power, then it's going to be a question of our power versus theirs. And not just black power. There's brown power, there's red power, there's yellow power. And there's an element of whites that defect. The rule in power in America with white people is the third rule. 1/3 for, 1/3 neutral, 1/3 against. That's how white people operate. If you dealt with power, you know that. Cabo Committee said that Malcolm X focused on human rights and not civil rights because civil rights are based on the law and can always be taken away. Remember again, those are terms that the media used. The movement was not focused on civil rights. It was focused on freedom. That's what the movement was focused on. And Malcolm had his definition, I've just described it, of human rights. King had his. I think King's was more solid. You hear me? And Malcolm's would have been more solid had he had more time to engage in struggle. So, yeah, human rights is fine, you know. Now, the point made by Alexandria White that I responded to before about how China is decolonized, and I went through that. I'm not going to repeat that. Definitely, there is a need for upgrading whatever you have, your technology and everything else. And that's a part of what goes on if you're building up real power among your people. In this case, in Africa, or in our own communities here in America, or in the Caribbean. So if you want to compare China to that, then look at how Deng Xiaoping did it. Study that. Took China out of poverty in 20 years, took 1 billion people out of poverty. Look at that, you know. But he took a way that is questionable, that is capitalism. But it's under a system that engaged in a long march, that engaged in a revolution. So they have some people that at least have some sensitivity to their people's needs. The capitalism that's being run there is state capitalism, with private capitalism having half, but the state having the final say. In this country, private capitalism has been about the profit of a few, period. Slavery, genocide, colonization, which is how this country was set up, and they moved throughout the world to carry it out. It has never been based on any progress for anything except the 1% that controls most of everything. So that's a real problem with capitalism here. Continental enslavement, true. LaShonda, always good to see you. See if we got anything on the bottom here. Gregory Jones, do Africans in America have the resources to present our case to the International Court of Justice in the manner of South Africa against Israel? Yeah, you could. The thing is, America has not signed on to the human rights conventions and stuff, so they're not going to want to respond to it. Yeah, you could. Would you get a hearing? That's a whole nother question. Because until recently, the International Court of Justice had been trying mainly African leaders. And this is one of the few times where they got into an area that they should be in this case, Israel, which most of the time they wouldn't touch because Israel has got too much support behind it. And they can always accuse you of being anti-Semitic. So, yeah, you could. But I see, I'm going to tell you something about me. I'm an organizer that I've never lost a battle. I'm not into symbolism. I'm a philosopher, and symbolism is fine, though I use another term for it. But I'm not doing stuff that's not producing results. I support reparations. I'm not a part of the leadership of the reparations movement because I know in my lifetime, no significant reparations are going to come down. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it. Do it, but also put your main energy in building power in your communities. Kurt Thomas, could part of the Chinese tactic be blood claims in African countries through the children of marriages? They certainly aren't going to allow these children claims in China. No, I don't think they got 2 cents interest in that. If any of them end up marrying some Africans, it's not going to matter. The Chinese have a tradition where a certain sector of their people go outside their country and establish businesses, first in Southeast Asia and then in other parts of the world. And then what they also have a tradition of doing is then sending some of those resources back to China. So the rebuilding of China under its modernization under Deng Xiaoping, some of those resources came from the capital money of neighboring Chinese countries and overseas Chinese, and then the skills of Chinese in various countries. So, and that's what we need, but we need to be careful because these leaders in Africa, many of them are crooked as pretzels. So if you're going to put money into Africa, you're going to have to control some investment funds and stuff like that. So that's a whole nother story. But China's pursuing its interests. We have to pursue ours. So I want to say I haven't been doing these live shows regularly. Glad to do this one because of the greatness of the person, Patrice Lumumba, and also my great friend and great brother, Nathan Hare. So I hope you got something out of this. Until next time, Hotep.